I've talked a lot about the misorientation of the ribcage, but the problem that we see is not merely that the ribcage is out of place. Today, we're going to look at what happens to the shape of the ribcage when it's habitually contorted by subconscious movements, and we'll also look at a quick way to start to get yourself out of this state. The proper shape of the ribcage has two curves that must be respected. At the upper end, we have the curve that is caused by the ribs getting smaller in diameter. This curve is present in nearly everyone. But when you habitually pull your upper sternum back and push your lower ribs forward, you get what Jeando Masoero calls a flattening of the thoracic curve. This is essentially an overextension of the upper end of the spine, which causes the head to move back in space so the back of the head lines up with the upper back. In this state, you lose the possibility for expansion of the ribs at the back, because this flattening is created by the ribs themselves being bunched together. The narrowing of the shoulders and upper back compounds the problem. As a result, the intercostal muscles are interfered with and breathing is negatively affected. Often, people will puff out their chest and their belly to make up for the fact that the back of their ribcage, which is supposed to expand the most during breathing, is being prevented from expanding. But there is a second curve in the ribcage that F.M. Alexander pointed out, and which Masoero also agrees on. When the lower ribs are pushed forward, they will even go up a little bit as the upper end of the ribcage is brought back and down. This clumps the lower ribs together, again narrowing the distance between the ribs. The ribcage should curve back at the lower end, but when the lower ribs are overly widened and bunched up, this curve is erased. The pushing forward of the lower ribs is playing a large part in this, which we can see clearly in this picture that F.M. Alexander used of the drill sergeant. What's so troubling about the combination of these deformations of the ribcage is that they restrict us right where we need expansion to breathe, at the back and upper parts of the ribcage, and narrow us from top to bottom, essentially crunching the ribcage. But we also get too much widening at the lower end of the front of the ribcage. This widening at the front lower end doesn't help us. We have no lungs that can expand here. What happens is that our abdominal viscera, where our organs are, is pushed forward. F.M. Alexander explicitly believed this was harmful to the function of the organs, disturbed digestion, and left one susceptible to disease and disorder. Masoero agrees, as do I. So what can we do to start moving our ribcage back towards its correct shape? One interesting procedure you can work with is to take an elastic band and put one end against your upper sternum and the other end at the side of your lowest ribs. You can also do this with something like a scarf, but it's better if it's something elastic. The directions are to move the upper sternum forward and up while simultaneously pulling the lowest ribs back. We want to stretch the band, meaning we want to increase the distance from the upper sternum to the lowest ribs, stretching the ribcage top to bottom. That will make the elastic band more tense. We want to do this by lifting the ribcage, so we don't want to drop the lower ribs at all to stretch the band. The lowest ribs really should go up away from the pelvis. You can try this in standing or sitting, but then you can use these directions in any situation. One more idea you can add in is to narrow the lower ribs at the front. Not only will this counteract the habitual over-widening, but by narrowing the lower end of the ribcage, where there is no danger of restricting the expansion of the thorax that's needed for breathing, you will make it more possible to lengthen the ribcage top to bottom. Coordinating these movements together will increase the distance between your ribs and increase the overall capacity of your thorax. To be clear, this is not an exercise that I'm suggesting. You do not want to do reps of this. We are trying to develop a new coordination of movements. The challenge is to coordinate the movement of the upper sternum with the movement of the lowest ribs, which is done by following the directions that you give yourself. The muscle and fascia will naturally change in response to this new coordination. Use visual feedback to confirm that you're actually doing what you intend to do. If the ribs are no longer being crunched together, the muscles will function better, which will lead to appropriate expansion of the thorax during breathing. That's something most people are missing out on because they have habitually made movements that diminish their thorax and alter the shape of their ribcage. The key thing to understand here is that we are using directions to change the condition of our musculoskeletal system. The problem is not a lack of strength. Even people who are quite strong will suffer from this deformation of the ribcage. The cause of this issue is the subconscious movements that we in the modern world tend to make, and the solution is to make conscious movements that undo this irrational habit. This deformation of the ribcage is not done intentionally, but it can be intentionally undone.